Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. Right at the top of the program, we're going to start with our friend Trey Yingst, who is in Tel Aviv. Trey Yingst, so we have this deal, obviously, with Hamas. I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, I think it's important for the American people to know that the Prime Minister of Israel is not like a president of the United States, particularly in Israel, where you have all these fractured parties, these tiny parties where 3 or 4 or 5 out of 120 members of the Knesset can bring down a government, correct?
Absolutely. And that was the Prime Minister's big challenge as he got this deal together with the help of the Americans, the Qataris, and the Egyptians. There were far-right members of the coalition who said, look, if the hostages get released, we have to be able to go back into war against Hamas. And that's some of the details of what we'll talk about in this agreement.
And in fact, they can go back, if I've read correctly from the various published reports. So it's 3 phases. And if Hamas does renege or start shooting missiles into Israel and so forth and so on, Israel has the right to go in and do what Israel needs to do, correct?
Absolutely. And President-elect Trump has made clear through his team on the ground in the Middle East that if Hamas does break the ceasefire agreement, the Israelis will have the support of the incoming American administration to take the battle back against Hamas. This is extremely delicate. And Friday morning, after a night of celebration in both Israel and Gaza about an agreement, things started to fall apart. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, through his office, released a statement saying Hamas was going back on the agreement that was hammered out in Doha, Qatar. Negotiating teams were able to sit back at the table and iron out some of those last details. And it looks like Sunday afternoon, we will see the first hostages released from Hamas captivity along the Gaza border.
Which is always wonderful when you can get hostages out of a hostile country or hostile territory with terrorists and so forth. But there is this forever long debate, isn't there, that when you negotiate over hostages, you encourage the taking of more hostages. And Hamas in particular, this seems to be one of the primary things that it does when it attacks. It goes in and it grabs hostages because he knows, at least for the Jewish state, they want those people back. So do you think that will encourage potentially more of that?
It certainly could. And look, it's a concern of the Israelis. Surprisingly, this deal is not popular across the political spectrum here in Israel. And it is because of the price that the Israelis will have to pay to get these innocent hostages home. They will be trading Palestinian prisoners, some of them who are convicted of terrorism and murder, that are currently serving life sentences in Israeli prisons with affiliation to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They're going to have to release them back into the West Bank or into Gaza. And it raises questions about what the future of this broader conflict is going to look like. Earlier in the week, we saw the current U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, say that Hamas has been able to recruit just as many gunmen as it's lost since this conflict began. And now some of the leaders, some of the people, the masterminds behind other attacks against Israelis will be free as a result of this agreement. And as the Israelis have seen during past agreements like Gilad Shalit, when we saw this Israeli soldier exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, some of those, and in that deal, Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind behind the October 7th massacre, can go back onto the battlefield. And so it's certainly a complex situation and a major concern for the Israelis.
I want to be clear about something. I want to clarify something. This isn't a peace deal. This is a ceasefire, perhaps a temporary ceasefire. Isn't that right? There's a difference between a peace treaty and a peace deal and a ceasefire. When you're dealing with a terrorist organization, it's very difficult, isn't it, to even get your mind around a peace deal when they exist for the purpose of destroying you?
That's a very accurate characterization. This is not a peace deal by any means. This is a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas in a 15-plus month long war that's been unfolding. A statement that was released on camera by the de facto leader of Hamas illustrates that. Despite the fact that there is an agreement to at least temporarily end the fighting inside Gaza, he celebrated October 7th and insinuated that the organization would continue to carry out attacks against the Israelis. And so this was not an off-ramp for a broader conflict in the Middle East. It's simply going to be a pause in the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, specifically inside Gaza. It says nothing about the West Bank and the Hamas and Islamic Jihad cells that the Israelis operate on a daily basis against there.
There's some talk about Abbas. He's almost 90 years old. He's not in good health. The Fatah party, which competes with Hamas, they had sort of a civil war there early on, and Hamas won and they took over Gaza. And the talk is that when he dies, that Hamas will even have more of an ability, more room to grab power in Judea, Samaria, other parts of the area there against Fatah. Do you see that as a possibility too?
Absolutely. Look, in the course of our reporting, we speak with everyone in the region, and I've talked to Palestinians both in Gaza and in places like Ramallah and Jenin to get a sense of where they stand after this conflict. And the support for Hamas is widespread. And without getting too far into the weeds, many Palestinians look at Fatah, they look at the Palestinian Authority, and they see an organization that is corrupt. They see the people around Mahmoud Abbas that have been promoted and taken the very high tax dollars and the U.S. dollars that flowed into these areas and put the money in their own pockets. And so they see Hamas as the only organization fighting for their interests on their behalf. And so Hamas maintains popular support in these locations. And so when Abbas ultimately does die, it's going to set up a massive question in the region about who's going to take over. If Hamas could seize control in a city like Ramallah and then be able to basically control not only the West Bank, but in a way Gaza, even if another leader is brought into the Gaza Strip. And this is sort of something that we should talk about. You hear the Biden administration talk about a transition government in Gaza and the ability for a third party to come in and create a stable situation. That's nice on paper, and it's nice to talk about that as an ideal sort of utopia for the region. But the reality on the ground is quite different. As the Secretary of State said this week, they've been able to recruit more fighters. They still have popular support in many different areas. And without looking just at the words, you can look at the images. Last Thursday, whenever this went through and we saw the celebrations in Gaza, there were masked Hamas gunmen in the streets of cities like Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah in the Gaza Strip, and they were celebrating because they are looking at what happened as a victory. And there's a real possibility that that sentiment carries over into places like Ramallah, Jenin, Tulkarem, these areas that still have popular support among Hamas.
You talk about popular support among Palestinians for Hamas. We talked a lot in this country over the course of the last year and a half about distinguishing Hamas from the Palestinians. And certainly there are instances of that. But the truth is, the Palestinians in Gaza, you've looked at the surveys from Palestinian organizations and Arab organizations, they do support Hamas, do they not?
It certainly exists on a spectrum, and it's been interesting to watch as the war progressed, because we've been talking with a lot of civilians inside Gaza, medical workers, and even members of Hamas. And I can tell you, among the civilian population, there was a growing frustration as the war continued that the war wasn't over. They saw the destruction brought against the Gaza Strip as a result of Hamas actions, specifically inside Gaza. And when you look at the public opinion polls in places like Ramallah versus Gaza City, the support varies. And so I'd say the Palestinians we've talked to exist on a spectrum. Certainly there are many who support the actions of Hamas. And again, they see them as the only viable organization fighting on their behalf. When they look at two options, Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, Fatah party, they look at Hamas and they say this is an organization that committed an attack on behalf of the Palestinian people. And they look at the PA as a corrupt organization that is working with the Israelis. And so it'll be interesting to see some public opinion polling post-war to see if it affected their support levels inside the Gaza Strip, understanding that if you go back to 2005, 2006, this was the organization that the Palestinian people voted for to lead their people specifically inside Gaza with a population of more than 2 million Palestinians.
It's hard to see how any Israeli government could really support a so-called two-state solution, particularly given what you're just talking about. There's an increased radicalization. Fatah is really sort of a weak party in many respects. And if Hamas is able to use this to further centralize authority under itself, and there's not a real competing force, I don't know where all these peaceful Palestinian leaders are. They're probably knocked off, or they're afraid to speak, or maybe most of them don't exist. But I can't imagine an Israeli government saying, okay, we're going to have a two-state solution and we're going to carve it out of Israel. Can you?
Yeah, I think that the Israeli government and the incoming American administration has to look at this at face value, what it looks like on the ground. Because from the beginning of this conflict, Israeli leadership from the Likud party, I can remember a conversation that I had with Israel's former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, when he was talking about an idea of creating basically islands inside the Gaza Strip, where the Israelis and the Americans would try to empower clan leaders or business leaders in this area to prop them up and build almost safe zones from Hamas control inside Gaza. And when they started to experiment with this, they saw that armed gunmen would take over the aid and threaten anyone who basically questioned their rule inside the Gaza Strip. And so it's not a simple fix. The other thing to talk about is the war objectives. One of the key objectives for the Israelis laid out from the beginning of this conflict was to defeat and destroy Hamas. Hamas is not defeated or destroyed inside the Gaza Strip or in other locations. And so they have to look at that and say, this is what we are dealing with on the ground. They still are capable of carrying out attacks. We saw in the images on Thursday night from inside the Gaza Strip, they still have weapons. Certainly their rocket arsenal has been largely destroyed by the Israeli air and ground campaign against Gaza. But as we look forward, they are not destroyed as an organization. And as we've talked about, they still have what you could argue in many locations is a majority support among the Palestinian people. And so it raises questions about what comes next. What does the day after look like inside Gaza? And that question at this point can't be answered.
Trey Yingst, I want to thank you. You're a remarkable journalist. You really are. You go to these various locations around the world, you put your life on the line, and you provide us with tremendous information. Thank you, my friend.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.